The debate and discussion. So thank you all for your interest, and I'll invite Goretti to give the seminar.
Thanks, Gillian. First of all, thanks to all of you for coming here today. And some of you I can see will have heard a lot of this before, so I hope that for those who have heard a lot of it before, that you won't mind me reprising it. Okay, so when Gillian suggested that I should do this seminar, she asked me for a title, inevitably. And the reason that I came up with the question of should we worry about child poverty in Northern Ireland is because there's a kind of a view in the media especially that really, you know, there isn't really child poverty in Northern Ireland, is there? There isn't really any great poverty. Anywhere in the UK or anywhere in these islands, and that somehow or other, you know, the places where there's poverty are, you know, it's like in Africa or Haiti or places like that where really you've got absolute poverty and people don't have enough to eat or roofs over their heads. And so that's why I sort of thought we actually really need to look at what is special about child poverty in Northern Ireland, and in particular, what's it like for young people who are growing up in poverty here. And that's pretty much, you know, why I asked that question. And the answer, as you could imagine, my answer was yes, we should worry about child poverty in Northern Ireland. And there's a range of reasons why I think that we need to worry about it. First of all, because of the way that it really impacts on a child's experience of their early years. And this is where you really see what child poverty means in Northern Ireland. Now, the last time that I did a seminar and there was a press release put out about it, there was stuff afterwards, you know, Newton Emerson was sort of poking fun and sort of saying, well, sure, how could there be? This is all just an issue about, you know, relative incomes. It's just, you know, when they say that there's this many children living in child poverty, it just means that there's many children in families that earn 60% of the median or whatever. So, you know, really it's not about poverty at all. Well, I would challenge anybody to live and to bring up 2 children on what a couple with 2 children get on benefits at the minute. I actually checked with Advice NI about this, and at the moment a couple with 2 children get £230.47 a week. That includes everything. That includes the adults, the money for the adults, that includes the child tax credits, and that includes the child benefit. So that's all they're going to get coming into their house. Now that is additional to housing benefit, it's true, and if you're living in social housing, then your housing benefit will cover all of your housing costs. But of course, social housing is more and more difficult to get, and any of us who work with people who are living in poverty will tell you that, or anybody who works in disadvantaged areas will tell you that with the growth of the private rented sector, many families now have to pay £20 or £30 a week out of their miserly benefits to subsidise, to supplement housing benefit. So some of those couples will only have £200 a week left to feed, clothe, keep warm. And during the recent cold snap, when we had our heating on, you know, pretty much 24 hours a day, I just couldn't help thinking, what must it be like for children who are in families who don't have the money to turn the heating on, and what does that do to your childhood, that, you know, you go into your friends' houses and they're warm, and then you go back to your own house and there's ice on the inside of the window. You know, how does that make you feel? And of course, as well as actually having a huge impact on the child's early years, it steals years of healthy life at the end of their lives, because we know that health inequalities are such that the children who are growing up poor now are much more likely to be poor when they're older, and that means that they're much more likely to die 5, 7, 10 years ahead of those of us who are lucky enough not to be living in poverty. And then, as well as that, one of the reasons we should, another reason why we should worry about child poverty is because, and this is what I'm mainly going to talk about, that it shapes the lives of the young people who grow up in poverty. It shapes their lives as adults. It impacts on what kind of jobs they're going to be able to get. It impacts on the level of control that they're going to be able to have over their own lives as adults, and also on the extent to which, as adults, they'll be able to live the kind of life that we expect in a society like ours, the level of comfort that they have, the kind of standard of living that they're going to be able to have. And so they're all good reasons why we should worry about child poverty. Now, you have in your packs there a piece of research entitled Persistent Child Poverty in Northern Ireland. I'm not going to talk about it. It's the work of some people who are here, Marina Monteith, Katrina Lloyd and Pat McKee. Basically their findings are that child poverty in Northern Ireland there's a high level of persistent poverty. 1 in 5 of our 21% of our children and young people live in persistent poverty, meaning that they're in poverty 3 out of 4 years of statistics that are examined. And that's twice the proportion in Britain. There's only 9% of children in Britain who live in persistent poverty, 21% here. And also there's a higher proportion of children in Northern Ireland who are poor at some time in their lives, so about 48% in Northern Ireland compared to 38% in Britain. So you're talking about, when you put those statistics together, that actually pretty much every other child in Northern Ireland is likely to experience poverty at some stage in their lifetime, and about a fifth of them can actually spend a significant part of their childhood in poverty. Now, one of the reasons that this is an important finding and has actually kind of started a whole lot of us who've been researching child poverty for a while going, oh, we got to rethink everything that we've been saying and look again at things we've been saying, is because of what we know the effects of persistent child poverty to be. Some people call Barnes and some of his et al., meaning I can't remember the other names, did a report for the Department of Work and Pensions in Britain last year, and they actually looked at much larger statistical sets than we'd have available here to us, and looked at what the outcomes of growing up in persistent poverty were for children and young people in Britain. And they found a whole range of negative outcomes, that such children were more likely to go without regular physical exercise, were more likely to be suspended or expelled from school, to be in trouble with the police, to live in bad housing, to have poorer health, to lack a number of material deprivation items, meaning that there's things missing from their home that the rest of us would expect to have, and also that there is that they were more likely to have 3 or more negative outcomes compared to children who were only temporarily poor. And really, it's the corrosive effect of growing up in persistent child poverty can have, and in particular the evidence that these children and young people are more likely to be suspended or excluded from school and to be in trouble with the police, are a part of the reason why I really do think that for Northern Ireland, this is something that we need to worry about. As a society that's emerging from conflict, the fact that we live in a society where there's a sort of a normalisation of recourse to violence, for example, the fact that we live in a society that's as segregated as it is, and when we know that there's this relatively large group of young people that we know statistically more likely to be not at school, not, we'll come on later as well to what they do after school age, and more likely to be in trouble with the police, is something that we really have to worry about, particularly because we know there's now a growing body of research, and I'll come back to it in a minute, about the impact on young people's mental health sorry, not the impact of it, but of the effect on young people's mental health of living in a society that is segregated and that is still a very violent society. That's actually an extra risk. And also there's the risk, and those of us who live in disadvantaged areas will know this to be the case, that young people in that situation who are very socially excluded can look to paramilitaries to provide a role in society, thereby really sort of helping to continue the possibility of a re-emergence of conflict. We know, for example, that international evidence suggests that peace processes, and we were talking about this on the way up in the car, because the main reference I have for this is the book that Paddy Hilliard and others wrote on poverty and conflict, the international evidence. And they suggest in that book that actually peace processes have basically one generation in which to consolidate themselves, or else conflict can re-emerge. And I don't think any of us want to see that happening. So really, this is one of the reasons, one of the main reasons why I think that we really do need to concentrate far more, focus far more on child poverty in Northern Ireland, and be much more worried about it than we have been, and than our politicians have been. You will, right, okay. I see when I to go back up here, talking about the fact that children and young people growing up in persistent poverty are much more likely to be suspended or expelled from school. They're also more likely to leave school without qualifications. This very simple table here shows you that children who are entitled to free school meals and therefore likely to be living on benefits, or their parents to be in receipt of tax child tax credits, are twice as likely, or sorry, half as likely to get 5 decent GCSEs, and 4 times as likely to leave school without any formal qualifications. And when they then leave school, they're much more likely to not be in education or training or employment. And I should have started off by saying that I'm going to be quoting here from what children and young people have told me in 3 different research projects that I've done over the last 5 years. And those research projects were one that I did with Professor O'Connor, who's here, on young people growing up in disadvantaged areas of Northern Ireland. One which was for Joseph Roundtree on the impact of poverty on young children's educational experience, just their experience of school, and also a study that I did for Save the Children, again on children and young people living in disadvantaged parts of Northern Ireland. And one of the things one of the questions that one has to ask is why so many young people living in poverty leave school early. One of the things that came out of all of those studies is that young people, actually children as young as 6 and 7, were keenly aware of the cost of their education to their parents, keenly aware of the fact that 50 pence that they have to bring in for no uniform day, or the couple of quid that they have to bring in for a school trip, or whatever workbooks need to be bought or whatever, that all of that money put a huge amount of stress on their parents, even when it seems like a relatively small amount of money. And as they get older, that's something that they're even more aware of. And actually, if you look at these findings here, which the Young Life and Times, which Katrina and Paula published in from the 2005 Young Life and Times, actually, you can see that it's not just that the young people are saying that they worry about the impact that the hidden costs of education have on their families, but also when it comes to saying whether they're going to go back to school after GCSEs, the respondents to the Young Life and Times whose families weren't well off were 4 times less likely to go back to school after GCSEs. And the fact that the educational maintenance allowance was available to them was much, much more important for the young people who weren't from well-off families. So in other words, money is a big reason why young people leave school early. And actually, it's a disgrace, really, that young people who are bright and who could stay on at school and do well feel that pressure to leave. And I think that it says something about the extent to which we kind of give young people false promises. We sort of say, oh, you can aspire to be anything, you can do whatever you want to do, but then we don't actually give them the resources that allow them to do that. Now, this is one of the reasons why young people leave school early, but they also are very clear about some other reasons why they leave school early. And the lack of respect from teachers is something that comes up again and again and again. When I did my first study of young people in disadvantaged areas, and this issue of the lack of respect for teachers came up, I actually thought that it was just those areas. I sort of thought, oh, you know, there must be snobby teachers in this area, and that it was just the three research sites I had, that those 3 research sites had particular problems with teachers. Then when I was doing the one for Joseph Roundtree, it turned out there were 6 different projects going on across the UK looking at the impact of poverty on education. And every single one of those areas where children and young people were spoken to, some of them were literature reviews and things, but every place where the children and young people were spoken to, the young people who were living in poverty talked about the lack of respect from teachers, and teachers shouting at them, and teachers treating them, you know, like dirt, basically. And this came up again and again and again. And in fact, and it does actually have an impact on why they leave school early. One, because they disengage. Because they feel embarrassed, because they feel that that children's negative attitudes, you know, puts them off staying on at school. But actually, as well as the kind of qualitative research that we've had, just again last year, the National Foundation for Educational Research did a study on why young people aged 16 and 17 aren't in education, training or employment, and they found that young people's experience of school was generally negative, that NEET young people's, the young people who aren't in education, training and employment, that they'd had a poor experience of school, and that their experience, I'm quoting here, that young people's experience of teachers and the perceived lack of respect from teaching staff impacted on their attitudes towards engaging in further learning. And really the young people that were interviewed in that National Foundation for Educational Research study said pretty much exactly the same things as the young people that I interviewed, where they talked about being frustrated with teaching and learning methods that were boring, that they weren't practical enough, that the teachers didn't show them any respect, that they picked on. This term, "they pick on me," is one that came up over and over again in a whole range of studies, and that young people, and that they especially picked on young people who were having difficulties keeping up with their work. Now, if you think about it, like if you're having difficulties keeping up with your work and you're being picked on, well, no wonder you'd leave school. Frankly, we'd all do it. And some of the quotes. I mean, this is a girl, 14. I said I think this young woman was in the Greater Belfast area. She said teachers should treat pupils the way they want to be treated. I mean, they wouldn't like if they were treated badly. It should be equal. A boy of 15, again in the Greater Belfast area, teachers need to start respecting young people more, like the youth workers do. That would push young people to work more, work harder. Up in the northwest, a couple of boys talking about some teachers just pick on you until you get suspended. Another one saying some teachers pick on everyone except for their favourites. And then a boy again, actually here in Greater Belfast, they would need to find better ways of dealing with pupils. If they misbehave, there's no need to shout the heads off people. And again in the Joseph Roundtree programme on education and poverty, again across the UK, this issue of children being shouted at by teachers was one that came up again and again, and boys especially seem to be shouted at. Now, I know it's very hard being a teacher, and I don't know how I'd handle 30 youngsters, especially if they were acting up and everything. It's bad enough just trying to teach, young adults. But to be shouting at people is clearly, especially young children, and there were children, as young as 6 and 7 complaining about being shouted at. It's clearly not. Going to help them. And this kind of lack of respect from teachers, who after all are the adults who are seen to have the most kind of status in the lives of young people who are growing up in poverty. If you think about it, if you're growing up in poverty, who's probably the most important person the person with the most status, it's likely to be your teachers. And I think that those kind of attitudes must have an impact on the emotional and mental health problems that young people seem to be having from very early on. Now there's mainly there's beginning to be some evidence about quite young children having emotional and behavioural problems, and there's I think there really needs to be some quite large-scale studies done to find out just how young the emotional problems are starting. But I wanted to use some of the Life and Times, because there's some amazing stuff in Young Life and Times which really hasn't been mined yet, I think, and we'll have to start making sure that happens a bit more. But these are findings from Dirk's research update on the Young Life and Times Young Life and Times findings last year on mental and emotional health and self-harm. And basically, it found that over a third of the Young Life and Times respondents, and remember it's a representative sample of 16-year-olds in the region, that they found that a third of young people from financially not well-off backgrounds say they had personal, emotional or mental health problems, compared with a fifth of respondents from well-off families. 23% of respondents from not well-off families said they had thought about overdosing or self-harming, but had not actually done so, while 16% had tried to overdose or harm themselves in another way at least once. Women in not well-off families were particularly likely, 4 out of 10 of them, to report mental or emotional health problems, and over a quarter of young women from not well-off families had thought about harming themselves, and 18% said that they actually did harm themselves at least once. Now, that's a lot about sort of looking mainly at young women, but of course we know that men and women react differently to emotional and mental health problems, and what men tend to do is to abuse substances, alcohol mainly, but all kinds of substances, and also to engage in other kind of risky behaviour, certainly, we know that is the case here. You only have to look at the binge drinking that goes on. You have to look at just this morning on our local BBC in the Northwest. There were youth workers on talking about, some of the legal highs that young people are involved in, but also the prescription drugs that people are taking. And it seems over the weekend there was like half a dozen young people admitted to Altnagalvin Hospital with overdoses of prescription drugs. Nearly all young men. So even if young men aren't saying, that I've self-harmed, well, if you drink or you take drugs to the extent that you have to be admitted to hospital, that's self-harming, even if it's seen as having fun because you're getting drunk or whatever. So the whole issue of male self-harming is something that I think maybe needs to be looked at, but from a looking at it in a different way, starting from a different way. Just to go back, the other issue that young people talk about, and young people are very, very open really about sort of saying things like my head's away, and I know that things are, I'm not, that they know that some of the things that they're doing, like the drinking and all, especially the drinking. And it's interesting that young people seem to be aware of the harm that alcohol does them, as much as drugs, even though adults tend to talk more about illegal drugs rather than alcohol. But the other really big issue, and one that, again, I think maybe needs to be looked at more, is the whole question of that it'll make no difference if they stay on at school, because there are no decent jobs out there anywhere. And again, this is something that the whole question of young people's aspirations and expectations, and the way in which the political discourse and the media discourse says that the problem with poorer families is that they don't encourage their children to have higher aspirations and to have higher expectations. Well, actually, that's a load of nonsense. All of the research with children and young people shows that no matter how poor they are, that they start off with having high aspirations. And again, this is right across the UK and across Ireland. It's not just here in the north that's the case. They start off with high aspirations. They start off thinking they can be anything because that's what their parents are telling them they can be. If you work hard, you can get on as well as anybody else. And then as they get a bit older and they start to look around them and they start to see what jobs are available, then they start to, their aspirations and their expectations start to drop considerably. And that is absolutely just sensible. From those young people's point of view. This is, I had a real problem when I was putting sources on these slides. So this comes from the poverty.org website. And if you look here and sort of see that in parts of, when the young people say that there are no decent jobs available, very often they're right. Because right across Northern Ireland, 18% of men who are working full-time earn less than £7 an hour. Now you work that out. A 40-hour week at £7 an hour is £280 a week. That is not a living wage by any standards. And even when you put tax credits on top of it, it still means that quite a lot of our families, working families, still have children who are living in poverty. In fact, half of all of the children who are living in poverty in Northern Ireland are living in families where at least one adult is in employment. And when you take, like I say, those percentages of people, one of the reasons I put this up is because there are actually areas, particularly in the west of the region, as you can see there, where a third to even more of workers are earning less than £7 an hour. Absolutely, I think absolutely shocking. And if you look at, again, this is from the poverty.org website, when you look at it in relation to regions in Britain, you can see that we have a very high level of full-time workers who are earning less than £7 an hour. You see, everywhere the part-time workers earn less than £7 an hour, they're women. And that's kind of why they're paid less. But you can see that in Northern Ireland, actually it doesn't really show. There's actually 18%. It doesn't look like 18%. It doesn't look close enough to the 20%. But 18% of our full-time workers, full-time male workers, are earning less than £7 an hour. So those young people are right when they say that that the jobs just aren't there. Okay, right. To get back to the young people, what it's like actually growing up in poverty in Northern Ireland. A whole number of studies now have found that children and young people who are growing up in poverty face social exclusion in a whole load of ways. In school, because of the stigma and their family's inability to meet the hidden costs of education, especially, and also the inability of their families to afford out of school activities. And also that they can't get involved in what you might call commercial leisure activities. So they can't afford to go bowling, they can't afford to go swimming, they can't afford to go to those paint bowling things, those things. They can't afford to go even to something as simple as the cinema. And but first of all, let me say that I don't think those things should be considered luxuries. I don't think that a child going to a cinema or something like that should be considered a luxury in our society. It should be sort of seen as something that everybody should be able to afford. But what it means is that the children then who are already maybe excluded at school because they can't afford to go on the school trips or whatever, are also then excluded out of school because they can't afford to do the same things as their friends are doing. And that's all pretty bad. But one of the things that really, really shocked myself and Marina, who were doing some work for Save the Children with young people in some of the most disadvantaged areas, was the extent to which even in those disadvantaged areas where basically everybody's poor, or everybody's a bit poor, that there was a group of young people, and they're almost certainly the young people whose families are living in persistent poverty, who've been in poverty for years and therefore have lost any little bit of cushion that they might have had before, that are actually excluded even from the kind of activities that you think don't cost kids. So things like birthday parties, things like trips away, day trips and things like that, that actually they're not able to get involved in those, mainly because they can't reciprocate. Because we all know kids don't want to invite somebody to their party who's not going to bring them a nice present or something. They don't want to, and if they're asked, do you want to bring a friend to the seaside with you today? Well, they're not. And this is awful because I realised that I had done this myself. We'll bring Annie. No, we won't bring Annie. We brought her before and she never brought you back. Do you know, that kind of thing, that level of not being able to reciprocate. And what it means is, that this is a conversation between a couple of children in a rural area actually, talking about, because a lot of when you're talking to children about poverty, you talk in the third person. What's it like for that child, as opposed to what's it like for you? And these children were sort of saying, well, children whose parents don't have much money, they can't go to parties or to the cinema. And I was saying, well, why wouldn't they go to parties? They don't have to pay like they have to go to the cinema. And the answer was, well, because they might not have enough money to buy a present for the kid. And then, because she was living in a rural area, she says they might not have enough money to buy a car to take them there. And this came up again and again and again with young people saying that, with children saying that you won't get taken to the beach nor nothing. That notion that actually there are young people who are excluded even within those most disadvantaged areas is particularly concerning. Okay, now I've managed to do something. Okay, I'm nearly finished. The thing that I think is probably the most worrying is really what one young man described as the ripple effect of the conflict. And this impacts most obviously on the young people who are living in the areas that are most affected by the conflict. And we know, of course, that they're also the areas that are the most disadvantaged areas. The geography of poverty in Northern Ireland is very striking. Alan McClelland, who's here, did some work back in 2003, which I quote all the time, and people are horrified when I quote it, that shows that half of all children living in households in receipt of income support reside in 16% of wards, and more than 3/4 of those children live in just 37% of wards. So, massive concentration of child poverty. Be interesting to see actually what that's like now, whatever it would be, 7 or 8 years on. But those areas, of course, are also the areas where the conflict was at its highest. And the impact of conflict in those areas is actually something that continues, that when you talk about the ripple effect, is something that continues to reverberate. It's not just about seeing somebody killed or knowing somebody who's killed like us adults would think about it. But for young people, it's about, for example, witnessing a violent event, maybe hearing people talk about it. A study that was done in Queen's just recently by Siobhan McAllister and Dina Hayden and Phil Scraton, again on young people in disadvantaged areas of Northern Ireland, which I'm delighted to say, I'm not delighted to say because it would have been nice if things had improved, but absolutely replicated everything on the studies that I'm talking about here. One of the things that young people in their study said, because they were looking specifically at the impact of the conflict, they said that that older people telling stories about the troubles, older people going over all the glory days, as it were, and talking about, the history of the communities and all that kind of thing, actually had an impact on how the young people felt about the conflict and about kind of keeping it going. The young people saw it as keeping the conflict going. But even without that kind of stuff, because of the level of segregation of society in Northern Ireland, and because of that normalisation of violence here, you had young people sort of, for example, being afraid to leave their own areas, and actually their lives being, the lives of young people living in poverty are always, the worlds of young people living in poverty are always very small. Whether it's in Dublin or in Birmingham or in Glasgow, they tend to live in quite small areas, and they see their worlds as very small areas. But here in Northern Ireland it's even worse, because it's not just, they can't go out of their area, they're afraid to go out of their area. So these are just two young people, a 15 and 16-year-old boy, talking about, it's actually in Derry, I think, it's talking about, you'd be afraid to leave your own area in case someone would decide to have a go, maybe not like the way you look or something, and then you'd get a hiding. And I said, was that because of your football shirts identifies you or what? I said, no, it could be anything. I've seen boys in Celtic shirts having the shit kicked out of them by fellas in Celtic shirts. Though obviously if you were wearing a Rangers one, it would be a sure thing you'd get a hiding. So, that says something about, like I say, the sort of normalisation of violence here. But segregation makes it even worse. And actually I've got two lots of quotes here, one from 14-year-old boys in a Catholic estate, and then one from a 16-year-old boy on a Protestant estate. So these are the two Catholics talking. We can only go as far as, and they name the street, or we'll get beaten up, and it's who'll beat you up. Huns, Protestants, that's their end of the town. And then this 16-year-old boy says, the top of the town is dangerous due to the risk of getting beaten up by Catholic young people. It's not so bad for girls, they don't get as much hassle as boys. So, that kind of just expectation really of violence really remains there. And at the same time as that's happening, we have a very difficult relationship between young people in those poor communities and the police. Now, obviously, an uneasy relationship between young people and the police is something that happens in every disadvantaged society, every disadvantaged area in every society across the world, whether it's Baltimore, like we see on The Wire, or whether it's, Birmingham or Dublin or wherever, you're going to have that kind of uneasy relationship. But obviously, the sort of contested nature of policing in Northern Ireland has led to a level of hostility and suspicion between young people and police here that makes matters worse. And I realise I've been going on for an awful long time, so I'm going to cut this particular bit a bit short, but there's a huge amount of evidence now with studies from Jarman, from Radford, the McAllister study, Quinn and Jackson, Hamilton. I mean, come up to me afterwards and I'll give you a list that long of studies about young people's interaction with the police in Northern Ireland that shows that they are stopped and searched much more often if they're poor, that the young people who are in the poorest areas are the ones who are really getting all of the focus of police attention, and that despite the fact that, and this is just the one little figure that I'll quote at you, is that only 15% of those detained, so young people, being detained and questioned and everything, but only 15% were eventually charged. So, it's not that there's young criminals who are being stopped and searched and young criminals who are being harassed. These are actually young people who mainly are doing nothing. And in fact, I spoke to one young fella who actually said that the police, I don't know if he was alleging this, obviously I'm not, but the way he was sort of saying it just sounded pretty definite. He says that he thought that the police actually hung around outside the Tech. He was going to the local FE college, and that he thought the police hung around outside specifically to stop and search him as he came out at lunchtime. And I was kind of going, you're exaggerating. And he produced this thing, I had never seen it before. And it was like a kind of a thing that sort of showed, why you've been stopped and searched. People who know more about policing can tell me if this makes sense. But he had all these dates written down when he'd been stopped and searched. And I was saying to him, so what are you... I didn't say, are you a drug dealer? But that was kind of what I was getting at. And he was going, no, but I do stand up for myself. As he said, I do stand up for myself. And I just couldn't help thinking, anyway. It would be really good to actually, again, do, a really good statistical examination of the 10,000 young people who were stopped and searched last year and see how many of them were actually from areas of disadvantage or not. But one of the things that I found really interesting was that in both Protestant and Catholic areas, because all of my research was carried out in both Catholics and Protestant areas, that young people perceived the police treatment as discrimination against them because of their class, in both Catholics and Protestant areas. So this is just these. I'm going to end on these quotes really. This is from a couple of males in a Protestant area in Greater Belfast. One says, the police treat rich people differently. The other one says, you wouldn't see peelers crawling, driving around real rich places. They're always around here. And the first fellow says, they're always patrolling this area, but there isn't much crime in this area. And the third guy says, see, if my house was broken into, I wouldn't call the police, they'd do nothing. And that's in a Protestant area. And then this is in a Catholic area in the northwest. Again, these are all males. One says, cops do circuits in our street when nothing's happening. The other one says, they just come around to annoy you. They were sitting down at the school with the back of the Land Rover open while we were at the fish shop. The other one says, they just nitpick. I don't think they sit up in a wealthy area doing that. And then the first one says, I don't think it's anything to do with religion. I think it's to do with background. It's more to do with the religious areas being rough, mainly working class. The the perception of those young people is supported by statistical evidence, because Ellison, who did a statistical, looked at back in 2001, so it would now be out of date, found that socioeconomically disadvantaged areas more than twice as likely, young people there more than twice as likely to have been stopped and searched than other children and young people. So just to finish off, I think that what I'm saying really is that the fact that some young people are socially excluded, even within the disadvantaged areas where they live, is alarming, because it means that there's nowhere where they don't feel an outsider. And given that the areas in which these young people live are those that are still feeling the impact of the conflict, where there's poor relationships with the police, and where there are those who are wanting to continue the conflict, and those who are wanting to recruit young people to continue the conflict, then there's a real danger that the level of exclusion faced by such young people will make them prey to those, whether they're drug dealers or whether they're paramilitaries, who offer them a role in the community. And actually, again, you can give examples of quotes where young people have implied this. Given that we know that feelings of exclusion and discrimination played a large role in precipitating the conflict in Northern Ireland, I think it's really important that we do worry about child poverty in Northern Ireland, and that we make sure that another generation of young people don't grow up feeling that they have no part in this society. Thanks, and sorry for going on for so long.
Well, thank you very much, Goretti. It's interesting to see all the different studies being brought together and pulling out some of the key points, and there's an awful lot of stuff there that we could talk about for a long time. But I'm going to open the floor now and invite you to make comments or questions. It needn't be questions and answers, it can be comments, or from your own perspective, how some of the things Goretti's been talking about reflect your own experience, perhaps in the areas you're working in. So I'll just move the mic down. Or try to. Going the wrong way. Sorry. Okay, so is there anyone who'd like to ask a question? If you, Linda, if you can just wait for the mic, please. Thanks.
Can you hear that? Okay. Goretti, thanks for giving us such an interesting seminar and reminding us that we do need to worry about child poverty. Can I just take you back to what you were saying about education? And I think you said that you felt that teachers treated young people like dirt, which is a great concern. But I was just wondering about the whole picture of it. Does that not link also to what you said about young people having given up on education, and the situation of teachers then having to deal with perhaps quite big classes, classes of 30 with young people who don't see the point of it or don't see the point of the method. So is it not a wider problem of perhaps giving teachers more support, more of the money? There has money been directed into education, but is there enough of it which will actually help teachers in that sort of situation to deal with that complex and difficult situation?
Yeah, it's okay. No, you don't need to.
I mean, you're absolutely right that teachers have a very, very difficult job. But it is also the case that the Roundtree Study, for example, that I did was with primary school children. So it was before they had given up. And again, there was a study in England at the same time, which was looking at also younger children. And in both of the studies, it was the children as young as 6 and 7 were complaining about teachers shouting at them, about teachers being generally nasty to them. And it seemed, what I felt was that it was a combination of a number of things. That, first of all, the girls got shouted at the same as the boys, but it was the boys who disengaged from education because of it. And I think there's a gender issue there, insofar as girls are brought up to be good and to get on and, to continue to behave even when things aren't going so good. But there was seemed to be an interaction between boring teaching methods, which weren't the teacher's fault because the way that the curriculum has been organised. I think things will be better with the revised curriculum, but the way that it had been, the teachers were told, you teach this at this time and that at the other time and that at the other time, and there's no choice for the teachers. Very large classes, even in primary schools in quite disadvantaged areas. Again, hopefully the revised curriculum will help with that. And all of those things kind of together were causing, especially boys, to start disengaging when they were still in primary school, when they were only 9 or 10, the poorest boys. And like I said, that wasn't just my findings, that was happening in England as well. And it's always kind of reassuring when you're doing research with children, when someone else has the same findings, because it means, you know, that it's kind of got wider applicability. Just in relation to teachers at secondary level, and I have a friend who used to be a secondary school teacher and had to leave after she'd had her nose broken by a young fella headbutting her, after which she had a nervous breakdown, and she's never been the same again. So I just want to say that I'm not blaming the teachers. There's a whole society out there, and then the teachers get, you know, the worst of it. But at the same time, something has to be done if that awful cycle of educational disadvantage is going to be broken. I suspect smaller classes and more resources, and also maybe training teachers in youth work methods, because any of us who work with young people know that young people just love youth informal education. They blossom in informal education, and given that that's the case, why can't we just sort of say, hey, this is the way to teach young people, not, you know, chalk and talk.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Yeah, there's one at the front, Brendan, thanks.
Hi, I think one of the issues that's sort of linked to education is what you were saying about the broader context there, that we do put a lot of expectations on children, that an education is a way out of poverty, or, you know, living in disadvantaged areas, and a way of, you know, further bettering yourself and your career opportunities and so on. And in fact, for a lot of young people, that definitely isn't the case. So even if the classroom environments were more positive and the ethos was more respectful and children wanted to be in school, I think one of the key issues is that when they leave school, those opportunities aren't there for them. And in the most disadvantaged areas, that's definitely the case. And when you're living in a society that has consistently experienced economic deprivation, that is made worse. So it's about that broader social and economic context as well that we need to keep on thinking about, as well as the interpersonal relationships within social institutions like schools.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because one of the things that really came out even in talking to kids in primary school is just how much they arrive in school with all these worries in their head, worries about what's happening at home and about money issues at home, but also about what they see on their way to school, or what they heard last night in their area or saw last night in their area. So, you know, we all have difficulties in concentrating when we have other things in our heads. Can you imagine what it's like if you're a wee kid and you have all this stuff going on in your head? So you're absolutely right. I mean, and thanks for pointing it out, because sometimes you get too focused on something like the classroom maybe.
Any other points that anyone wants to raise? Sorry, I can't really see. There's a lady at the back.
Thanks, Goretti. I was just wondering, you were talking about the incidence of stop and search and so on. The whole democratic process, or what we call democratic process, depends on people turning out to vote. And when you think of the series of elections that are upcoming, politicians are more inclined to listen to people who are voting, and the pressures are not coming from the poorest areas and those children. So how would you sort that? Starting now.
I think that's above my pay grade. I think would be. I mean,
need paid more.
Just one thing I would say is that, I mean, we do know that young people. Again, when I worked for Save the Children, this is a whole 10 years ago now. We did this project called The Real Deal, which was working with Demos in London. It was just after Labour had been elected to government, and we worked with like some young people from the most disadvantaged and the most socially excluded young people. So they were all young people who had, you know, problems with substance abuse and early school leavers and all that kind of thing. And we to actually look at policies and how policies might affect them, and it was really, really interesting. They were absolutely well capable of engaging and well capable of having ideas and talking to politicians about them. We went over to Downing Street, and you know, Gordon Brown had, at those days, he was only the Chancellor, you know, had organised a meeting for them and all, and there was all these ministers came in. And I was really, really very impressed by how sort of the young people from right across the UK were able to engage with them. So it's not, you know, that young people aren't interested in politics, but one thing that young people will say to you all the time, and they say this to you, you know, I meet young people all the time in my private life as well, and the one thing that they always say is, you know, politics here is a load of nonsense, and what they mean is the orange and green stuff. So there is maybe, so either they're complete sectarian gits, you know, who won't talk to you if you're not wearing the right colour football shirt, or they're saying, you know, politics here is a load of nonsense because of the orange and green stuff. And there doesn't seem to be any, I don't know. We can only hope that I was saying this in the car on the way up, I hope that recent scandals and everything will cause everybody, and I'm saying this for all sides, you know, that it'll cause everybody to be a little bit more humble and a little bit more sort of, you know, not feeling that they have the answer to everything. And that might help young people as well feel, you know, that they can be more involved.
But can I just add that I think there's been some quite interesting evidence from the recent American presidential election in terms of the involvement of young people from groups that previously were never involved, and that was all to do with the social networking and that sort of approach. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out in the context of the elections in the UK in this election, to see if that migrates to here. There's evidence of both ways, but in America there certainly were groups involved that had never previously been involved in actively in campaigning and in voting. Interesting to see. Okay, is there any other points before we break for a sandwich? No, I think everyone must be ready for their lunch.